That's how it is. It'd be great.
Well, I've got to ask all these historical questions.
Okay.
So I've looked up the history of some things.
Thank you, everyone, for taking your seats. Let's begin. On behalf of La Trobe, right around the Murray and the Albury Library Museum, welcome, everyone. Welcome to our live audience and those watching via live stream. Thank you. And before we begin, let's pay our respects to the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet tonight, and also the lands upon which our live audience are watching from, and acknowledge the elders past and present, and pay our respects to any Indigenous people here tonight physically or in the audience listening to our discussion. So thank you. We particularly thank them for their custodianship and their generous sharing of knowledge. Okay. So tonight, we're very privileged to be here to celebrate International Women's Day, which is on the 8th of March. La Trobe University and right around the Murray present this panel, a discussion on the historical and contemporary experience of women in politics. Tonight, we are privileged to have Cathy McGowan, a sixth-generation farmer whose first taste for politics came as a research assistant for the federal member of Indi, Ewan Cameron. And I'm sure all of you who've read the book already are on top of this. In 1983, she established a consultancy business which sought to bridge the gap between the community and parliamentary bureaucracy, and subsequently worked as a rural affairs advisor with the Victorian Department of Agriculture. Cathy was president of Australian Women in Agriculture, and she established the Women in Dairy discussion groups across the country. In 2004, she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for service to the community through raising awareness of and stimulating debate about issues affecting women in regional, rural and remote areas. McGowan was also a recipient of the Centenary Medal in 2001. In 2013, Cathy became the independent federal member for Indi, winning the seat of Indi after the coalition had held the seat for 82 years. So clearly a watershed moment and still worth celebrating. And we're here today to celebrate, of course, Cathy's 2020 achievement, which was publishing her biography, Cathy Goes to Canberra, Doing Politics Differently. Or as I've heard it said, Cathy Does Canberra is a short title, perhaps. So the book is a handbook on how to be elected and how to survive Canberra. It's a manifesto for an alternative community-based politics told through the prism of her story. It tells the story of campaigning to win Indi around the kitchen tables of and negotiating good policy with major political parties. While in Parliament, Cathy developed policy around regional development, a National Integrity Commission and a Code of Conduct for Politicians. Don't we need that? And drought policy. We're also privileged tonight to have Emeritus Professor Judith Brett. Judith joined La Trobe in 1989 to teach and research Australian politics, political biography and political history. She retired at the end of 2012, but thankfully she's not stopped doing what she's very good at, for which we're grateful. She's committed to engage political research, bringing the fruits of her inquiry to the general public through books written for a broad readership and also through the media. Among her publications are the award-winning Robert Menzies' Forgotten People, Australian Liberals and the Moral Middle Class, and 3 quarterly essays. In 2017, she published The Enigmatic Mr. Deakin, which won the 2018 National Biography Award. And in 2019, she published a study of Australia's voting system, from secret ballot to democracy sausage. She writes regularly for The Monthly on contemporary Australian politics. Now, we also had Kat Bennett on our program. Unfortunately, Kat was no longer able to attend, and she really regrets that she was unable to contribute tonight. Kat is an early years health promotion coordinator for Gateway Health, where she supports Wodonga schools to address mental health, healthy eating, physical activity and gender equality in the school setting. So we're very sorry she couldn't contribute tonight and regret her absence. And my name is Jennifer Jones. I'm a Associate Professor in Interdisciplinary Studies at La Trobe University in the Albury-Wodonga campus. And I've been at Albury-Wodonga for about 5 years, having moved from the Bendigo campus. So I'm committed to regional education and education equality for regional people. I've got a couple of books myself, including a recent one called On Tanarang Land, Sharing History and Culture, and also a co-edited book, Black, White and Exempt, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Lives Under Exemption. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about another really fabulous book, Cathy Goes to Canberra. So how we're going to work tonight is we'll have some set questions that I'll ask both Judith and Cathy, and also questions that Kat was going to answer that we'll address to both of them, and they can either answer one or not, depending on their preference. And then when we've finished that process, we'll open up for audience questions. So you can think about what you'd like to ask while we're proceeding. So let's get started. So my first question is to Judith. Cathy McGowan became the first female independent to sit on the parliamentary crossbench because community members encouraged her to stand. Who was the first female to represent an electorate, and what was her pathway into federal parliament? And how has women's pathways to politics changed over time?
Okay, well, it's really fitting in that the first woman elected to an Australian parliament, it was 100 years ago today, Edith Cowan, who was elected to the Western Australian Parliament. Australian women, well, South Australian women got the right to stand for Parliament at the same time as they got the right to vote in 1894, in a sort of an own goal where the Conservatives were desperately trying to stop the passage of the bill that would give women the right to vote. So some bright spark moved an amendment. Let's attach the right to stand for Parliament as well. That's so absurd that all those Liberals who were supporting it, you know, will vote against it. And so, as I said, it was an own goal because then the women hadn't even asked for the right to stand for Parliament. So that was then incorporated into the Commonwealth Franchise Act in 1902, that women got the right to both stand for Parliament and to vote. However, that being the case, it's a long time then between drinks. Edith Cowan gets in 1921. She was 61. She'd had a very active career as a sort of volunteer. It wasn't really a career, that's the wrong word. She'd been a very active life as an advocate for women's issues, trying to start women's hospitals, interested in police, family protection issues around children and maternal health, those sort of a bundle of what she would have thought of as social issues. But she stood as a member of the Nationalist Party. She'd had a couple of goes standing as an independent. And what's interesting is there'd been a few women candidates prior to her, but they'd stood as women. They'd said, we don't want to stand for one of the parties, that there's a bunch of issues around, particularly that affect women and affect women as mothers of children, and we want to represent those. So they didn't join the parties, and in not joining the parties, they didn't get elected. So in the end, Edith Cowan did get elected. However, she believed that she would vote according to what she saw as the interests of women, and so she crossed the floor a couple of times and she lost her pre-selection. Surprise, surprise. So that was the first one. And then, as I said, it's a long time between drinks. There's not another woman in the Parliament until another 20 years. Edith Lyons, who is the widow of a Prime Minister, so she's got a big public profile. She's already had 11 children, so we know she's done the traditional thing. She won in her husband's seat. And Dorothy Tangi, who was the Senator for Labor. Then there's the odd woman, but it's really not until second wave feminism that you start to get a real tranche of women being pre-selected for winnable seats and getting into Parliament. So really not till the 1980s. And if we look at women in the ministry, the first cabinet minister with a substantial portfolio is Margaret Guilfoyle around 75 in Malcolm Fraser's government. So, you know, it's not Australians like to think that they pioneered women's suffrage, but they were very slow on women's representation.
Interesting. So I've got a related question for Cathy. You talk about the importance of exercising or using the courage muscle in your book. To what extent do you think women are underrepresented in politics because they self-limit or underutilise that courage muscle? Or is it the patriarchal political structures that are continuing to exclude them?
So good evening, everybody, and just thank you for turning up in such numbers tonight. So I don't think it's either or. And I had the lovely experience last night with women in my book club talking about leadership. And where we got to was the different space women like to use their leadership skills. And they like to get things done. So that ability to get things done means they don't often feel they've got to be at the top or the front or the chief. They can be president, secretary and treasurer doing the leadership stuff. So I think there's something about women getting things done that's important here, and they want to be effective. So there's not a lot of women I know who want to do things just for the sake of doing stuff. And if it means you're running for parliament and never getting anywhere and being ineffective with your time, well, that's not for them. So that's one thought. But the other one I have is about the patriarchy. And I watched with great interest in my early political awareness, Joan Kerner. I'm Victorian, I fell in love with Joan Kerner, not only because she came from a community basis. She got women, she got neighbourhood houses, she got school committees. She understood community. And then a little bit later on in her political development, I think she was very responsible, perhaps after she finished being the Premier, to being part of Emily's List within the Labor Party. And I watched Emily's List with great interest, which stands for early. I wrote Emily, early money. Anyhow, it's a Labor Party way of supporting women to get elected. So what actually I saw happen in the Labor Party was a positive process for getting women safe seats and getting them elected, which the Liberals and the Nats have never done. The Liberals and the Nats have always thought it can just happen. So by the time it comes to this idea of a courage muscle, for me personally, I decided that I wasn't interested in that political Canberra politics, that I'd made a decision that I was very interested in leadership and I was really interested in making a difference and, being in the fray. But I chose agri-politics for my place. So there's members here tonight from Australian Women in Ag, and it's lovely to have you here. But I thought that's really where I wanted to play in the patriarchy of agriculture, getting more women into leadership roles. So it's a choice of where you want to play. And while agriculture was hard, it was much more welcoming for women in ag. So I pick up on the point that you made, Judith. We're never going to have, we were never going to win in politics by having a women's party. So it wasn't just the courage muscle, it was also the patriarchal structures, I don't think, are designed for women to be effective. I think they're designed to use up a lot of your time and space doing good voluntary work. They're not actually designed for you to be effective in your policy process. And I think many women looked at that and thought, I've got better places to use my energy rather than the playing in that political sphere.
Could I add something to that?
Absolutely.
Because I think one of the things we have to do is, particularly when we're looking at parliamentary politics, which we're focusing on in some ways, it's deeply gendered in its history, that parliaments get the rights to make laws and then to run the government from monarchs 15th, 16th century, when fighting with words replaces fighting with swords as ways for groups of men to settle their political differences. So it's actually about men's competition for political power and setting up a sort of a game or a framework within which that can happen without people killing each other, without them raising armies, And so the whole way, so it's about the management of male aggression. It's about the management of men's competitiveness. And so the way Parliament's organised with the two teams and the Speaker who establishes the rules, it's deeply gendered in that way in its history. And I think a lot of women, they look at it and they think, that's not the way I think. I'm not that interested in being in a team, black and white, them and us. I'm interested in much more in finding solutions to problems, because yes, sometimes that system finds solutions to problems, but it also can fail to solve a lot of problems. I mean, it seems to me we've been living through a decade in which our Parliament has not been doing a very good job at solving a lot of the problems facing us as a society. But there's a sort of an intensity of political conflict. And so I do think that that's quite alienating for a lot of women, just in the way that you say, that there's a big problem with the institution.
So in terms of supporting women who find themselves in representative politics, how important has networking been for those women? And is there common ground between women in politics that works outside of the party system?
No, I didn't find. I found common ground with lots of people, but rarely on gender. And it wasn't to say that there weren't some women that I worked with, but it was usually on the issues that we worked with. However, on the crossbench, yes, there was enormous camaraderie and networking. And I have to say, again, that wasn't gendered, because when I first got elected, it was Adam Band, he's Labor, Melbourne, very first phone call said... Green. Sorry, Adam. Green, Melbourne. But the very first phone call said, welcome. What you want to do, Cathy, is get office 115. It's the best office. It's next to mine. This is how we do it. And then you need to talk to this da-da-da. A whole lot of really intricate little detail. And I said, oh, Adam, but what do I do about staff? Because the office was empty. He says, look, come down and meet with me. So David, my partner, is here tonight. We hot-footed it to Melbourne very soon, and we spent a day in Adam's office looking about his office systems. Oh, thank you. And then once I got to Parliament, Andrew Wilkie from Tasmania, now he's Labor, now member for Denison, now Clark.
Independent.
And again, Andrew and I met every week of the time we were in Parliament to talk about legislation that came together. So enormous. But that was when I was the only woman on the crossbench. But things changed when Rebecca Sharkey got elected. And I just want to acknowledge Susan Benedico, who's here tonight, because at that stage, Nick Xenophon was the leader of the team. And Nick met me when I went to Parliament and he said, no, we've got to find out how you did this. How did you do all that? And what can I learn from you? Or what can South Australia learn from Indi? And so the answer to that was he had a convention in South Australia, and Susan went across on behalf of Indi and ran workshops for his candidates on what we'd done about community engagement. And one of the key students of that was Rebecca Sharkey. And she says now to this day that she did everything that Susan Benedico told her, and thus she got elected. And door knocked. She had a campaign of $88,000, but got communities involved. And I can remember talking to her before she got elected and saying, good luck, and don't hesitate to give me a ring. And as soon as she got elected, she rang me and we set up, here's how you do it. There'll be nothing in your office. Here's all the stuff. So we had Rebecca straight away. And then a little bit later, we had the magic of Malcolm standing down and Dr. Professor Karen Phelps getting elected. And both Rebecca and I went across and we campaigned with her because she was running as an independent. And we said, look, we'll help you as soon as you get elected. And the same thing, when she got to Parliament, we were able, in that sisterhood way, to share all the office stuff, all the staff stuff, all the job descriptions, how to get your office set up. And then we walked down the aisle with her, like, it's a wedding. So Rebecca and her on one side. So that was that. Rebecca and I had created the culture that helped her get accepted. And she was Sydney, and I'm going to say probably a bit surprised by the warmth of the community environment from Rebecca and I and how we made it work. I don't think she was expecting such camaraderie. And then when Julia Banks left the party and came across, again, we provided a nest for her and made her safe. But we also did something else which was really important in that sisterhood way. We absolutely knew we'd watched what had happened to Mr. Slipper. Do you remember
Yeah.
when he crossed the floor and became the Senator, and how incredibly badly he was treated? He was really punished for what he did. They took him to court. They were just so vicious. And so Rebecca and I and Adam and Andrew were really worried that would happen to Julia Banks, that they would absolutely ruin her reputation. So we talked among ourselves. We thought, how are we going to protect her reputation? So we took upon ourselves in a very obvious way to go and speak to the opinion makers in the Liberal Party and say, don't you dare say anything publicly against her, because if you do, we're going to come out and call your bluff on it. And they didn't. And they did a little bit of under white-anting her in her electorate. But if you look at what happened, none of the leaders of the Liberal Party publicly, I mean, they got up and walked out on her when she made that famous photo, but none of them absolutely criticised her, and they didn't vilify her as they'd done for Mr. Slipper. And I suspect that's because we did that job on those leaders and saying, watch what happens. And at that stage, for example, me going and talking to Scott Morrison, which I did regularly, and Rebecca saying, you've got to treat her well. She's made a conscious decision, and you guys are going to lose enormously if you attack her. So we sort of used the gender thing that you can't attack a woman, but much more than that, we knew how vicious they could be, and forewarned was forearmed, I think.
So did you actually threaten that you would withdraw your confidence?
No, never threatened anybody.
Right.
Ever. Oh, we didn't have to.
Right, yeah.
And people often think about us as independents about using the threat of your vote and doing deals. Like, it's so much more subtle than that.
Yeah. Okay.
We never, ever threatened, ever. And we never did deals. But actually just gently raising it with the Prime Minister, that we were watching her closely, that we were looking after her. We expected him to make sure his team didn't say bad things in the public, because that would be very not good for him, would it?
So the mentoring and support was
but the sisterhood very strongly. And I think so that was what we were able to bring to the place. And it was always subtle, but it wasn't unconscious. We knew we were operating in a patriarchy, and we knew we had to look after each other.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is for Judith. Cathy's book is subtitled Doing Politics Differently. What do you think characterises the conventional way that women have done politics or political representation in Australia?
Well, look, I guess the conventional way, given we're talking, let's focus that on parliamentary politics in a way, because I think we need to remember that women do politics all over the place. They're really active in community organisations, in managing the politics of their extended families. There's, what I want to say is about parliamentary politics. Conventionally, essentially, you have to go in through the parties. I mean, that's what the history shows you, and it's really only pretty recently that we've started to have some success with independence, and it's partly because the parties have got a bit hollowed out, I think, and I think they've lost a bit of their sense of direction. If you look at the women in the past, they tended to go into politics when they were older, either when they'd raised their families, or when they had a fair bit of sort of life experience under their belts. And men also used to go into politics when they were older. After they'd had a successful business. This going into politics from being a staffer and getting pre-selection maybe in your early mid-30s, it's pretty recent. I mean, and I have a lot of reservations about it, actually. I don't think it's particularly good for people either in terms of their own life experiences, or I don't think it's particularly good for us as a country. I think we lose out on a lot of the sort of wisdom and life experience people have by going in a bit later. So I've a bit lost track on the question. But the other point I would just make there is that some of the Asian, if you look at somebody like Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, and the woman who was the first female Prime Minister who was a Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, they both became successful politicians after 50. When the sort of terrible last couple of weeks we've had, and the sort of sexualisation of younger women that goes on, when to some extent they're actually freed from that, and I think that gives them a lot more room to move than and as I said, and they're not trying to manage having a young family with what's an incredibly demanding job. I mean, I remember seeing Kelly O'Dwyer having her second child, and I just thought, why are you doing this? I mean, this is probably a very unpopular thing to say, but, you know, you've got quite a lot of decades in your life. You don't have to cram it all into your 30s. You can do these things in your 50s and your 60s, you know, and so anyway, that's...
Thank you. Cathy, you say in your book that community representation and grassroots power means you achieve your aims, the aims the community wants you to represent and to achieve. How do you negotiate this when the aims of the community are not in line with your views?
Now, I really want to talk about this question with a bit of detail, if I could, because that didn't happen. It didn't happen because the group of people who were behind setting up Voices for Indi made sure that we came from a platform. We started with the community, and that community, we can talk about what that is. So one of the very early things that Voices for Indi did was consult with the community about what they loved about the community, what their values were, what they wanted from their representative, and what the issues were. So by the time I was out there as a candidate, it was sort of like I'd grown out of that. So it wasn't like I didn't belong. I actually was the daughter of that community. So it was very rare that anything I did conflicted. But I do want to give one example. It did happen. So one example was, and it was the marriage equality legislation, or not the legislation, but the survey. So I had gone to that election saying to my community that I was going to support marriage equality. And while it wasn't a big issue for me, it was a big issue for many of the young people in my electorate. And they had made sure that I'd made a commitment to that. I said, yeah, there's no problem, I'll do it. Thinking, oh, that's going to be interesting, we'll see what happens there. And then when it came up for debate, which went over for quite a few years, there was a lot of mail that came into my office, emails, phone calls, and mostly I would say from churches saying, well, we're not going to vote for you, we think it's wrong, and we want you to support us protecting family. And I thought, well, here's going to be a nice little conflict happening here. How do I manage this? And so I was able to do what I'd promised that I would do, which was one of the things that had come out of our conversations, was that the community said of their Member of Parliament that what we want you to do is to turn up. They'd never actually said they want we to agree with us, but we want you to turn up and come to us. Don't expect us to go to you. And I'd made a commitment that I would turn up. I'd go to an opening of an envelope, which, you know, I did often. But so when we got this conflict beginning about marriage equality, and we had huge numbers of letters and mail and some very cross church groups, that I asked my staff that we would then ring up the person who'd signed the letter and say, well, could Cathy come and meet with you and your congregation? And I'd turn up. And so over a period of time, I have to say that I went to every single one of those organisations, not only churches, who wrote to me against marriage equality. And that was fine. And I just want to, but the magic of it was that when I would go to, say, a church group, so the Baptist church group in Wodonga, and the elders would be there, and they'd say, Cathy, we want to talk to you about it and see if we can change your mind. And I'd listen, and we'd go through the prepared speech. And then I'd say, well, actually, I hear what you're saying. Here's what I've heard you say. And they go, yes, that's what we said. And I say, well, can we agree to disagree on this? Because I'm not going to actually do what you've asked me to do. And they go, oh. And I said, and now that we've talked about that, can we actually talk about what we really should be talking about tonight, which is the work of the Baptist Church in Wodonga about disadvantage and the enormously good work you're doing with young people, and how I, as a Member of Parliament, can actually support you on what you are really doing in this community. And once I did that, they engaged in a real way. Yes, Cathy, what we're doing is this, and would you come and meet the youth groups, and would you come and do this? And then we would actually have a real conversation about how I could represent them in their community as opposed to a policy position, because I wasn't going to change my mind. And then we'd do all that conversation, and then I'd finish in saying, okay, so let's get this right. We're going to agree to disagree, aren't we? And they go, yep. And I said, however, what we've found out is we only disagree about 0.01%, and that we actually agree on all the 99% of the stuff that you're doing. And they went, yep. And I'd say, great, how can we work on this stuff? So we'd leave with respect and we'd leave with honour. And then, so that's how we did it. And then when I voted, it was interesting because when the survey came out, and I should know this figure off by heart, but I think it was 65% of the electorate backed marriage equality. And that was Victoria. But across the border here in New South Wales, it was something like 54%. It was a much lower number. And I suspect deep in my heart that we changed people's minds in that process about marriage equality. That leadership role that I was able to play in the community around difference and how you manage difference really did make a difference. So that was one example where there was misalignment and we worked our way through it. So it rarely happened, but when it did, that was my approach, to actually go and talk to people, sit down, see how we can resolve this together. But then the other thing that I did, which was a trick up my sleeve that I learnt very early in my politics day, was I'd say to them, particularly the church groups, I say, you really care about politics? And they'd go, yeah, we're fascinated. We watch it all the time, we watch The Insiders every Sunday and we do everything we can. And then I would say, well, would you like to come to Parliament and work in my parliamentary office as a volunteer? And many, many of them said yes, because we had this volunteer, which many of you have done, this volunteer program where people would come up on the Monday and work as volunteers in the week. And by Monday, they'd be sceptical, cynical, something or other. By the time we got to Thursday afternoon, I go, oh my God, I never understood. It's all about organisation. Like, it's not about politics getting things done. It's actually about networking and creativity and building a line, all those women things, getting things done and not playing the competitive game. And they could see that and they loved it, that they had many of them, that they had a member of Parliament who actually wanted to work with the community around getting things done. And then the end result of that, I say to the group, okay, well, now you've seen how things done, go back to your church group, get them all organised and get a little bus and they can come up and do their own lobbying. Oh, could they do that? Yeah, you can do that. So that's the sort of way we worked around it. And it's a bit like doing politics differently because my colleagues in the parties would go, Cathy, how do you get these volunteers up here? Do you pay them? I said, no, we don't pay them. You don't give them a stipend? I said, no. And they said, well, how do you find them? And I said, well, I go and ask them, do they want to come? And they say, yes. And they would go, oh, I don't think it would work for me. And I said, no, I don't think it would work for you either. You've actually got to like people. You've got to give them time. You've actually got to give them in the office a priority. Because you're a community politician, you're not a party politician. So they're the priority that you're actually working towards. So it actually was magic, the watching all that theory of doing politics differently, doing it, I'm going to say properly, work out. It just was wonderful.
So is this the methodology for re-engaging youth? The question I was going to ask Kat was one of the reasons cited for youth disengaging with politics is that their generational values and priorities, if they're progressive, aren't being represented, particularly in rural areas. So is the problem exacerbated in country communities, but is it also solvable because of the values of country communities?
Well, for us it was. But the thing that, again, made it work is that, say, for example, once a year we would do this major consultation around the budget and and Helen Haynes still does this, getting input of the community into the budget. So rather than expect the young people to come to me and tell me what they would think, we would organise breakfast and we'd pay for the breakfast and we'd pay for transport and run them in Wangaratta, Wodonga, Mansfield, wherever we were. And the school captains would turn up, the disability school would turn up, they'd all come for the free breakfast. But in the process, actually give us such good information about their lives and what was important to us. And the purpose of that was actually to support leadership, because what we wanted was a community where the leaders were valued. So here was I, as a Member of Parliament, able to bestow status credibility on the leaders of the schools and saying your point of view is important. And then again, of course, invite them to Parliament and they'd come up to Parliament. And I'll just finish on the young people, because we had this little program going. It was just so much fun for me. How could we get that leadership respect happening for young people? And one of the colleagues, Chris Hayes, who was a Labor member from Sydney, I saw him in the parliamentary dining room one day, and he had 4 kids, young adults, in their school uniform in the parliamentary dining room, which is silver service. And I called him afterwards and I said, Chris, what was all that about? He says, oh, Cathy, you should do this. And I said, what should I do? He says, well, what I do is, don't tell anybody, but I write a letter to all the schools in my electorate, the high schools, private and state, and I say to them, to your leadership, to the principals and the leadership team, that if you can get to Canberra, I will take you to lunch in the parliamentary dining room. And I said, oh, and do they do it? And he said, yeah, absolutely they do it. So I did this, put a letter out to all the principals saying, principals, if you could get you and your student leadership team to Parliament, I would like to take you to lunch in the dining room. And they did almost every single, not every single, but many of them came, and they came every single year, bringing the leadership team there. So we always would take a photo of them in the parliamentary dining room, and then they'd come into Parliament, into the actual Parliament, and there's a magic thing at 1:30 every day called 90-second speeches. And you can so I'd make a 90-second, which is 1.5 minutes speech, and I'd point about these leaders, and in the speech, I'd talk about what they'd told me over lunch. So over lunch, we'd talk about what was happening in the school, what were the leadership issues, and then I'd make a speech about it. Great, I'd acknowledge the kids, the young people in the balcony, and then the magic would be that would be all videoed because Parliament videos those speeches. So then we'd make the little clip. We'd send it back to the school. The school would then put out a little note in their newsletter saying, here's our leadership team having lunch, or being referred to by Cathy McGowan. And the kids would just love it. It was just one of the best things that I did in my time, because not only did they get the respect that they deserved as leaders, no one was telling them they weren't there yet. No one was saying it'll all happen when you leave school. Here were they being acknowledged. And then what would happen without fail is I'd go shopping, and the mother or the grandmother or the great aunt, she said, oh, I'm so-and-so's aunt or great aunt, and I saw the photo and that was so nice. And I'd be in tears and going, oh, that's so nice. Oh, and let me tell you what they're doing now. They're at Monash University or La Trobe, and I'd get the full story. But it was just so there was something about having a community member of Parliament who loved people, and I was constantly thinking how I can respect them in their leadership roles rather than getting them to do the work. And I so rarely saw that with my colleagues, because their idea about power and success was often about them. They couldn't see the referral that was happening. I got the power and the love, but I didn't get it for me. I got it because I was able to do whatever it was I did, like the mothering auntie thing that I did so well. Does that make sense?
I think it's called capacity building.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also, it's partly because of the fact that the parties have become so disconnected from community life. In a way, the sort of things that you're doing, it's a bit like what the Labor Party was able to do in its very early days. It was where there were people, I remember reading an article that was based on inner city Melbourne, but there was one party member for every 40 members of the population. So everybody knew somebody who was in the party, so they could tell them, look, about this or that problem that they were having, and this fed into the parties. But the membership now, it's like it's become separated, and that's why I think starting this movement of getting community-based independence may revivify our parliament. It's obviously not going to be the whole thing, but we've got to somehow get our central, decision-making institutions back connected to community processes and to changing life experiences of the different generations.
So, leading on from that, in the past, how did women politicians handle gendered expectations of their era and the demands of politics? To what extent were women leaders restricted to traditional women's issues, or areas that were of expertise conceded by men to them because they were women?
Well, look, there's 2 points I'd make there. The first was, firstly, there weren't very many women back in the day.
There's only been 143 women in Parliament.
Does that conclude the state parliaments?
No, only the federal parliament.
Yeah, but firstly, there weren't, so back in the day, there weren't very many of them. But the second thing I'd say is that this is often put up as a bit of a criticism. Oh, the women get in and they get given the women's issues. Well, actually they're really important issues. You know, I think that's yes, we've now had a woman foreign minister with Julie Bishop, but you know, Susan Ryan got Minister for Education. Margaret Guilfoyle started off, I think, in social security or social services or whatever it was then called. She ended up as a Minister for Finance because she had an accounting background. But we don't want to denigrate those areas, I think, because they're actually some of the ones that have an enormous impact on the day-to-day lives of people in a way that, say, foreign affairs doesn't, you know. But we haven't had a woman treasurer yet.
Can I answer that too? Because I was very conscious of that. I was an older woman, postmenopausal, country. And I again, with the team around me, my community gave me enough confidence that I was okay as that. They voted for me, and they voted for me twice because there was no pretense about who I was. So that gave me great confidence that being a woman of a certain age with the skills I had was quite fine, thank you. You know, it was. And when I got to Parliament, I thought to myself, well, I don't want to compete with the blokes ever. That's not where I'm going to go. I can compete to win my seat, but once I was in Parliament, I was going to use my other skills to get things done. Because those guys, if you want to compete with, you know, it's the story of the willow tree and the oak. That if you're an oak tree and you know something happens, you snap, you broke. With your willow tree, you can bend. And I thought, I'm going to bend. I'm going to work this out. So one of the decisions I made quite early in the piece that I was very comfortable in my skin, and I was going to actually project and claim the space of a mature age country woman. That's who I am. That's who I was, and that's what I was going to be. And I knew that for lots of people that was CWA or less, for lots of people had opinions about that. But for me, I'm very proud in that role. But I played it, I think, to perfection. And I don't know if other people could do it. You'd almost have to be a farming woman to do it. But one of my friends gave me this lovely tea set, an orange tea set. So we would regularly have morning tea out of the tea set with the pot and the sugar and whatever. One of my friends, Liz Wood, some of you would know her. Liz Wood would regularly make homemade cakes, usually fruit cake, and we would always have fresh cakes for morning tea. And so I would invite people who I needed to do work with and say, hey, drop around to my place for morning tea. My place, morning tea. And they'd turn up, the blokes mostly, and they go, oh, Cathy, this is a beautiful office. It's what have you done here? Because there was flowers, always flowers. Di, where are you? Di Thomas, always flowers. And then we'd sit down here and we'll have a cup of tea, and then the staff would go and make a cup of tea. And we'd have this little tea ceremony. And they couldn't talk business until they'd had the cup of tea. They had to just sit and be there. And I'm going to finish off with this because at the beginning it was a self-protection method for me, you know, being true to myself. But by the time I finished, oh my God, it had worked so well. And I'm just going to tell a quick little story about how it worked. That socialising and creating community, which is what Country Women did, which is what I did in Parliament House, worked. And then we used to do a thing called a midwinter soiree to get people together to come, because morning teas would work really well. So we thought we'd have Rutherglen muscat and Christmas cake or fruit cake, and Middlewood cheese. And that we invited, say, 20, 30 people, and they all came and they had a lovely night just talking to each other. You know, the press gallery, everybody. It was a mixed group. Anyhow, it went so well that we ended up doing it once a year, particularly at Christmas time, and we called it the Very Crossbench Christmas Party. So it was, and this is sort of about the networking. So the first one, the big first one we did, we had, Clive, because he was a crossbench. We had Andrew Wilkie, Adam Band, me. Oh, we must have had Rebecca, maybe Rebecca wasn't there. But anyhow, it was an eclectic mix of people. And when I finished on my last Christmas there, when we had the crossbench Christmas party, I think we had something like 500 people turned up. And in Parliament, I'm going to have to stop telling these stories really, but in Parliament, you were not allowed to have corridor parties. You've got to fit into your office. We had a corridor party +5, and the speaker who makes the rules came up, and they were all there. They all turned up to be seen. And the host was, I'm going to say, frumpy Cathy McGowan from Indigo Valley, well, glamorous, but, you know, because I was probably the only person in Parliament House who could have hosted that sort of gathering. And it's a bit like the mother-in-law or the great aunt, because who else is going to get all the family together and make sure they don't fight and have enough food for everybody and, you know, do it all. So those skills that country women bring to the world, I was able to bring to Parliament House. And I say it with great enthusiasm now, because when I look back and think about it, that was no accident. You know, that's what you guys do, we do. We just don't often do it in Parliament. And there's not a lot of the skilled people who can do socialising and networking Parliament. If they were ever there, they've left.
Well, it's also because it goes against what I was talking about, is of the deeply gendered structure of the institution into these two teams.
Yeah.
And staying loyal to your team and going with the team, whatever it is that your conscience tells you, that whole, rather than finding the things that are shared. And because networking is about building links. It's not about up and down all staying together in our teams, you know. And so I think that's interesting. I mean, the thing is that the Australian Parliament is probably more team-based than, say, the British House of Commons, where there's because there's a lot more members, you know, there's 600 or something. And so there's a lot more people can vote against their parties, and there's a lot more independence. Whereas our Parliament is, I think, dysfunctionally disciplined, I would say. And so I think it's really good to see these.
Yeah.
And it's also to say this, why the fact that the government doesn't control the Senate is, I think, enormously important, because it means that negotiations have to happen if legislation's to get passed. And that means there has to be trust built and relationships established.
And I think you can hear from my voice, like, what fun it was.
Yes,
And
it sounds totally exhausting.
It wouldn't, but it wouldn't have been fun if I was in a party and had to behave. And I just had enormous sympathy for all the women that did, because they were just doing so much work staying in the team and finding their patron, you know, they had to get permission, they had to get patrons, they had to be working the system all the time. Here was I doing social work.
Doing it differently.
Yeah.
This is my last question to Cathy before we move to audience questions. So Cathy, one of the things you said in your book was that being your best self was an expectation of a representative and working to achieve the aims of the community that you represent. How do you... Oh, I've already asked you this question.
Yeah. We've picked it up. How do we reconcile different?
We could probably we could have questions, because you've only got 10 minutes left.
I wanted to ask you actually about that being your best self, that sometimes the expectations seem really like even unreasonable. You know, we all have bad days. How did you manage that to be that persona all the time?
Well, I do want to acknowledge Di Thomas, who's in the audience tonight, because Di was my chief of staff, and the Voices for Indi started, the very first thing we did was agreed on values. Before we did politics or policy, what are the values that are going to drive us? And then what are the behaviours associated with those values? And then when we ran the campaign, people actually had to sign up to those values and behaviours. So people didn't come on board if they weren't interested. But once they'd signed up, that was being your best self was, no, we actually don't talk about the opposition. We understand the team bit. If we're talking about the opposition, we're not actually talking about what we could do. And the opposition will suck up all our energy if we talk about how bad they are. So we don't talk about the opposition. We only talk about what being an independent could be. So be your best self, stop gossiping, stop telling tales, don't do any of that, actually be positive. So when I got to Parliament and with our staff, it was the same thing. There was butcher's paper in the room about be your best self. And what did it mean? And it was frequently that we would have decisions that we would have to make that were really quite tricky. And it was Di's job as chief of staff to always remind us, and Jeremy in the office as well, if we're going to be our best selves, how will we behave? Was the question we regularly asked. And I'd go, oh, okay, I won't do that then, I'll do this, or I won't say that, or whatever it was I was going to do, because I was and the staff held each other to that commitment. But it wasn't an absolute set of rules. It was the question, what does it mean to be your best self in this circumstance? And is what you're doing actually your best self, or is it just you pretending? And we tried not to pretend. We really did try to be our best self. So while it was always challenging, it was really lovely working in an environment where people were on the same page about that, and you could have the discussion and people could call you to that, which they did regularly. And in the book, I tell a story of going shopping and meeting somebody, a woman from somewhere, and she said, Cathy, I've written to your office and I haven't had an answer to my letter, and you said you were going to be your best self and you're not. And I'm really cross about it, like in the supermarket. And I go, geez, I'm really sorry about that. What can I do? Well, blah, 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 blah. She told me off. And I go back to the office and I say to the staff, can you find that letter? And the end result is we actually had to transform how our office worked because our administrative systems weren't up to scratch. So our customer service wasn't good enough. So we had, for example, we had a 21-day turnaround on constituent inquiries, and that was too long. So we actually had to transform everybody to get a 7-day turnaround. And then we had to transform our constituent management computer program because it wasn't up to date. So we had to get a new system. And to do that so that I wouldn't be harangued when I went to the supermarket. But the end result was fantastic because we actually improved all our office admin stuff. So in fact, that sort of criticism was so useful because it made us much better at what we did and made me much better as a Member of Parliament.
And it is possible to be your best self a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think we worked really hard at it. And when I wasn't, I got told. So there was really quick feedback loops.
We're going to move to questions from the audience seated in the room, not the audience watching, unfortunately. Who would like to ask the first question? I'm sure there's questions there. And then Sally, the next question.
Thank you. This is to both Judith and Cathy, and quite a self-interested question, I might say. But to see the conversations that went on in Indi, that whole community movement and the conversations, can that translate to a state? And can that translate to another house, that is the Senate? So Judith, I don't think it's been done before, but is that possible? And Cathy, what's your view on it?
So Susan Benedica, who hasn't introduced herself, is running as a Senate candidate for Victoria, as an independent Senate candidate. And so she's announced that and underway, and there's a Facebook page, and talk to Susan later, because I think her question is that's what she's going to try and do, is in the Senate, as opposed to being a party representative, to actually be a community representative, and her community is going to be the state of Victoria.
And I think that's actually quite hard because reading Cathy's book and hearing her talk, I mean, one of the things clearly that you were able to draw on was the fact that people had a shared sense of place and a shared history. And so there was a sense that there was a community there that you were representing. Now, does Victoria exist as a community, you see?
Oh, it does if you live in New South Wales.
Yeah, no, and yes, I mean, that's true. But also, I mean, even like I live in Melbourne and in a suburb, and I don't think that the suburbs and the electorates of the suburbs, have that same sense of community. I mean, there's, because there's not, people have moved in and out, there's not the same sense of generational continuity. I don't think there's such a strong sense of place. I think there's a sense of place of Melbourne, but I live in Northcote, so I do think that there's something about community in country where there's a strong sense of place that can be drawn on. So I think that's pretty hard for Victoria. Though that being said, I do think that there are some things about that Victoria's political culture is different certainly from New South Wales political culture. I mean, probably speaking out of turn, but my sense of what's happened in our politics at a national level is that things actually have gone a a bit downhill since it being run from Sydney. You know, that the political culture in New South Wales has been a much more combative one than the Victorian political culture's been, and you know, so it is a more progressive state, I think. But how one actualises that sense, I think, is a challenge. So,
The next question was, Sally.
Good answer. Good answer.
Thank you. This is a question for Cathy. I'm thinking about Helen Haynes and the way that people brought you on when you first arrived in Parliament. And I wonder how you see your role with Helen, a colleague, a mentor. How do you do that now as you pass the baton on?
So it's negotiated and it's not assumed. So we talk about it, and we have talked about it all the way through. What does she want from me and how I can support her? So that's the baseline. A second thing to say is that I have incredible respect for her and her ability, and I am enormously proud that she's my Member of Parliament. So I think she gets flooded with, oh my God, you've done such a good job. So I think I've got to pull back on the praise probably a little bit. But then I'm there to help her. So it's not unusual for me to pick up some gossip that I might hear around the place, and I ring her up and say, look, I've just heard X from somewhere, do you know this? And she said, thanks, that's really useful. Or this last 3 weeks for Helen, for all the women members of Parliament, has been, particularly for the crossbench, because they've been carrying that sense of holding the government to account around gender in particular. And I know it's been incredibly stressful for her. So I was thinking, well, how can I support her? So I bought a couple of books and sent them to her. So when she came home from Parliament a couple of weeks ago, there was just a little gift for her. Today, for example, Marcia Langdon is in town, and Professor Marcia Langdon and Helen organised in Wodonga a conference where Marcia spoke about the constitutional recognition of Aboriginal people and their working paper, and Helen invited maybe 50 more people to come and be there. So I was there for that, and my job is to support Helen by turning up to those sort of events. So yeah, I'd say it's a close, negotiated, supportive role, but also I'm incredibly conscious that Helen has got her own flavour and her own way of doing things. So I sometimes think of I'm not, but if I could just say it as a mother-in-law, you know, it's not my job to bring up the kids, but I'm there, and negotiating that is how we sort of do it. But also, I don't want to be there anymore either. I feel like I did the job for 6 years. I'm really happy that she's doing it so well, and I've got lots of other things that I want to do. So I don't want to get caught up in the busyness of that job anymore. Yeah.
A question for both. The males in the Parliament, I don't think have covered themselves with glory in recent times. How do you both see the prospects for a different way of thinking from younger males to achieve a situation where they're not doing the things and making the same mistakes as perhaps their older contemporaries have made?
Well, look, I'll just say one thing, I mean, about the situation. I mean, I think that the part of the problem, and I don't want to deal with the Christian Porter issue, I think that's a different one, but that there is no proper employment structure for the staff, for the staffers, for the ministerial staffers, the backbench staffers, you know, and there's been quite a lot said about that, and I think it's absolutely imperative that some form of more conventional employment structures are put in place inside of Parliament. You can't have, you know, because to become a political staffer, it's essentially a patronage relationship. And so you can't then complain to your patron if one of your patron's favourite golden-haired boy has been filling you up in the lift, you know? You're in an impossible situation. There has to be somebody, some independent employment like in an HR department. So I think I'm hoping that that's become crystal clear, you know, like we have to have some sort of federal integrity commission, seems to me. So I think that would actually it wouldn't resolve things immediately, but it would mean that the sort of young men that I think you've got in mind would know that there's actually complaints, you know, that they're not going to get away with stuff, that the women the women would not be as vulnerable. And I think that's really important. So that's the main first answer. Do you think?
And the bit that I want to add to your question is I actually don't think it's about gender, quite frankly. There's a whole lot of people in Parliament who haven't behaved well. And for me, it's a bit what Judith said at the beginning, is once you realise why Parliament exists, instead of having battles and killing each other, it's designed to have battles of words. And once you understand that there's two main teams and they're dancing with each other, if you want. Once I understood that, then I could see, well, my job is to create more, if that's the game, the balance between keeping your integrity and being part of the system is a tough one, which is why you've got to be really conscious of what your best self is. But creating competition in the system creates enormous change. So, for example, we created competition in Indi. It had been a safe seat. And just watching at the last 2019 election, watching how the parties, Labor, not so much Labor, the Nats and the Libs circled around when you had a strong independent, watch that dance was something to behold. So I think you'll get everybody behaving better within the rules and the structure we've got when you've got more sophisticated, clever competition. So if someone's misbehaving badly, a staffer or a member of Parliament, and then a good independent says, don't like what you did, we're going to run against you, we're going to get a really good community campaign, and we're just going to call out what you did, regardless of the gender, you'll find that competition in the seat will create change very, very quickly.
Yeah, well, I would back that up because I'm in Northcote, which is now Cooper, was Batman, where we had David Feeney. Absolutely, you have to say, you know, hopeless. Absent Labor member of Parliament who was then caught out about tax issues and a whole lot of things. And the Greens put up a really strong candidate. They almost won the seat. Labor's then pre-selected Jed Carney, who's fantastic. You know, we've now got a really, so I switched my vote back from Green to Labor because of that, because I was not going to vote for David Feeney, nor were lots of women going to. But so I think that's probably that's exactly right, that the Greens gave them such a run for their money and they would have lost the seat.
And I'm going to be very political here, which I'm allowed to be, and to say to the people of Farrer, you are in a safe seat. You are missing out on so much. Not only
People of
things, this electorate of Albury is Farrer.
Okay.
And not only are you missing out on things, you are missing out on quality, I think, because you don't have competition in the system. You don't have debate about politics. You don't have debate about issues. You don't have any debate about how your member behaves or what she does. Because there's no one other than the Liberal Party, and her pre-selection is the only thing that holds her to account. And I want to say to those of you who live in New South Wales, that's a choice you've got. Because the people in Victoria, Indi, said, well, we don't like it, we're going to do something. And I just don't see the people of Farrer going, oh, it's too hard, we can't be bothered, we're never going to do anything. You know, Kevin Matt tried, didn't get anywhere. You know, Chris Brooks, the irrigator, he tried, it's too hard. Maybe, but if you don't have that competition in the system, you really can't complain about the level of representation you don't get, quite frankly. So I'll say that as a bit of a brave thing to New South Wales people. Get organised, talk to each other.
There's the challenge.
Yeah.
Another question.
I've read your book, Cathy, and very much enjoyed it. And one thing that was loud and clear was to never compromise on integrity. So is there another example, or can you unpack where you've had to make, you've had to remind yourself of that when it's mixed with deadlines and passion and pressure and conflict of, checking in with yourself or other people around you?
So I'm happy to tell it. There's a story in the book about it, and it was the hardest. It was a very challenging time for me. So the story is about Malcolm Turnbull and I. We had a very respectful relationship. And if you remember, in about 2017, the Section 44 dual citizenship debacle happened. And they were two numbers down. Barnaby had to go for go and have another election, and John Alexander in Sydney. In Bennelong. So Malcolm's position was very delicate. And we all knew that. So we were all dancing around each other in a way. But then what happened, and the book tells the story in more detail, but Malcolm approached me about, would I like to be the speaker? And I have to say, in telling this story, that Malcolm Turnbull has a way about him. He didn't get to be the richest man in the world through being a slob. And I found him very charming, very sensitive. And he, I'm sure, maybe subconsciously, but I'm sure he did this, set about seducing me, really. He wanted to win me over. And he was extraordinarily, David, are you still here? He was extraordinarily effective at that. And I have to credit his wife, because she must have taught him a lot. But he was very, very good with how he handled me. He didn't ruffle me at all, which is, a bit of an art. And he was always respectful. Anyhow, he didn't just say, would I like to be speaker? No, Malcolm didn't do that. Malcolm came at it like, Cathy, Australia's in a very difficult position. And you're a great patriot. And the country needs you. And he said, not only does the country need you, but have you ever thought, you often come and talk to me, which I did, about how badly parliaments behave. I'd be regularly, can't we do something about parliament? It's just shocking. And he said, you regularly talk to me about that, and you write me letters, and if you were speaker, you could actually do something about how parliament behaves. Oh, gosh, run down my neck. And for a bit, I thought, he's right. I could be a speaker. I could imagine myself being. You'd be a very good speaker. Yeah, like a bit school marmish and telling people, and I fantasised about it for a bit. And then what the nation needed, we didn't want to. China was happening and things were going on, and whatever. Anyhow, I told him that I'd think about it, because that's what you do when someone says something like that to you. But I have to admit, when he finished talking to me, I was pretty sure that was something that I probably really could think about. And that was until I got home, and I thought to myself, what would be the cost of me being speaker? Is that I'd run as an independent, and here I was no longer going to be an independent. But so that temptation, and I look back on it now and I think, how could I have possibly been even tempted? But I really was. And I rang up some of my advisors, the people whose opinions I wanted, and I put it to them, and they were quite flabbergasted that I'd even think about it. And I can't remember, David, if we spoke about it, but at the time it was like, well, what would you say to people who voted for you as an independent if you became the puppet of the government? They wouldn't really like that very much. I thought, no, that's right. So it wasn't so much then about being my best self that got me out of that. It was my loyalty to my constituency, that I had said I was going to be an independent and I'd stay that way. So by the time we got to Monday, I realised that there was no way I could be speaker. What was I thinking? And then it was a really difficult conversation to ring up the Prime Minister and say, look, I've thought about it and the answer's no. And I did that. That was a hard conversation, because it's a bit like telling your lover that you're not going to go out with them, Not quite like that, but something like that. Anyhow, he was so light. He says, oh, yeah, that's okay. I didn't think you would accept my offer anyhow. Because he knew me, really. I wasn't going to do that. But it was a very tricky situation. And I was so grateful that I had my values and my community to keep me grounded. And I often think about it, how tempting power is. How seductive it can be to be offered when people you admire think you're really good at something and they offer you something that maybe you didn't want. And it wasn't about money or about power. It was actually about saving the nation, you know, or some grand fluffy idea that he put to me.
That's unfortunately we can have one more question and then that's it. So our final question.
Did you want to make a comment?
No, that was... No, I haven't... No.
Jill.
Judith, I'm wondering if you've got some examples about countries where women actually hold the power and whether the combative nature of the political decision-making is as heightened as it is in the Westminster system. Are there any countries
Yeah, well, look,
where...
that's a good question. Countries which have systems of proportional representation get more women elected, and we can see that even in our own parliament, where it's easier for women to get selected for the Senate than it is for them to get a single member seat, because there's 3 winnable positions. You know, 2 guys are going to get one and they can get a woman on. But if there's only the one prize, well, then it's much tougher. So the Scandinavian countries and some of the European countries where you've got either systems of proportional representation or multi-member electorates, it's been much easier for women to get winnable positions. It is less combative because you tend then to have governments which are coalition. I mean, I'm actually quite a supporter of minority governments. I know this was, again, a bit of an unfashionable position because when Julia Gillard was leading a minority government, they said, oh, this is terrible, you know, we'll never have decent government. But again, I think that more voices at the table, having to do deals or compromises and it pulls you into the centre and you get better policy outcomes. And even with the Senate, I mean, I think things which throw sand under the legislative wheels, are good, because then it's not just that the crossbench has to be persuaded, but things don't get pushed through as fast. It gives everybody time to actually think and for people to say, oh, look, I haven't, did you think about these possible consequences, or to and it gives a chance for pressure groups to come in. It gets a chance for some media debate. So, I mean, the critics of those sort of coalition governments say you end up with something like Italy, where actually the coalitions are so unstable that, governments doesn't happen. So you want something a bit in the middle, I think.
Well, that's all we've got time for, sorry. I know we could stay talking and asking questions for a long time, but let's instead finish. And there is opportunity for the live audience to buy a book. They've been very thankfully, and we thank the Library Museum for allowing the sale of books, and we thank in particular Dimmicks for selling Cathy and Judith's books, and they'll both be available to sign your book for you. There's more book-related discussions here at the Library Museum, including Plenty of Politics with Barry Cassidy and friends. So make sure you look up the Sydney Writers' Festival live and local program, and on the Right Around the Murray website, so you can watch some of that happening. It's being live streamed to the Library Museum for 3 days, on the 30th of April to the 2nd of May. And then, of course, we've got the Right Around the Murray Festival itself. This year, 15 to 19 of September, for loads of great author talks, much like the one we enjoyed tonight. So sign up for the e-newsletter on the WAM website so you don't miss out on anything. And thank you for our live stream audience. I'm sure you've been fantastic, and fantastic as the audience here tonight. And thank you especially to our speakers. And can we give a round of applause?
Thank you so much.